Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 107 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. I mention this at the end of each episode, but since it's been a while since I've seen a new one show up, I wanted to put a reminder up front that adding a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts, and or other podcast sites, but Apple is still the big one, will help grow my show, which is a quick and free way you can help me out. Thanks! On to this week's question, which comes from patron Jesse Clark, who wrote, quote, I was an avid Dragonlance reader growing up, and I recently discovered that there was a comic series based on them. Do you know if these were just graphic novels of the books, or were they original stories that furthered the story of the companions? How long were these printed? There have been a few different comic books named Dragonlance, and I'll get to those, but first, for those unfamiliar, let's introduce you to the Dragonlance setting. In the early 1980s, TSR, the original and at that time current publisher of Dungeons & Dragons, wanted to put a spotlight on the latter half of that role-playing game's name. At the same time, the husband and wife team of Tracy and Laura Hickman, having just been hired by the role-playing publisher, started coming up with an idea for a whole new world, as well as a storyline that was dominated by the mythical creatures. Having the support of the company, the Hickmans gathered other TSR employees, Margaret Weiss, Larry Elmore, and Douglas Niles being some of the core creative team, and they fleshed out the story that would become the home for the Dragonlance saga. Originally pitched as a series of modules, pre-written adventures, it was soon decided to also have TSR branch out into publishing fiction. Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss paired up and wrote the original trilogy of books in the Dragonlance world, collectively called the Chronicles, which followed closely, but not exactly, the path of the 12 modules, and introduced readers to the Heroes of the Lance, also known as the Companions, which is the term Jesse used in his question. This was quickly followed up by the Legends trilogy by the same authors, a time travel fantasy which mainly followed the twin brothers Caramon and Raistlin, along with Tasselhoff Burfoot, from the first trilogy. Critical reception to these books has been mixed. Some feel they are childish and or cliché, while others feel they are archetypical but well written. But readers flock to them in droves, leading TSR to publish more novels in this setting, as well as their other settings like Forgotten Realms, Dark Sun, Spelljammer, and more, making TSR one of the most successful publishers of fantasy fiction throughout the 90s and beyond. At this point, nearly 200 books have come out with the Dragonlance banner, although the first 6, written by Weiss and Hickman, are the ones that most fans think of when the setting comes up in conversation. A new book by Weiss and Hickman, titled Dragons of Deceit, the first in the Destinies trilogy, is set to release August of this year, and although we know very little at this point, We do know that it also involves time travel, and from the description, may end up retconning some of the less popular changes to the setting and creating a new timeline. Dragonlance has been so popular that, as mentioned, in addition to the novels and the role-playing books, there have also been video games, calendars, and all sorts of other ancillary products involving this setting, and that includes comic books. DC and TSR teamed up to first create graphic adaptations of the original 3 books. DC and TSR teamed up to first create graphic adaptations of the original 3 books, with former Marvel editor-in-chief Roy Thomas writing all of these, and artwork provided by Thomas Yeats, Tony De Zuniga, and Ron Randall. These were printed starting in November 1987 as treasury-sized graphic novels under the name The Dragonlance Saga. The saga should have spanned 6 volumes, but the books were released very intermittently. The second volume came out in June of 1988, then Volume 3 came out 5 months later, but Volume 4 wasn't released for another year and a half. So sales petered out on these, and only 5 were ever published, leaving these original adaptations stuck in the middle of the 3rd book, Dragons of Spring Dawning. In 2005, new adaptations of the Chronicles were licensed by Devil's Due Publishing, and over 3 years, all 3 of the original trilogy were adapted, spanning 24 issues or 3 trade paperbacks. These were adapted by writer Andrew Daub, with art by Steve Kurth for the first 2 novels, and taken over by Julius Gopez and Pere Perez for the final book. Devil's Due also published adaptations of the first book in the Legend series, Time of the Twins, and the Legend of Huma novel, the only non-Weiss-Hickman book to receive this treatment. However, none of these are what I am guessing Jesse was referring to when he said he discovered a comic book series based on Dragonlance. I believe he is actually talking about the monthly series that was published by DC Comics between August of 1988 and September of 1991. This series is unique compared to all of the other Dragonlance comic works I have mentioned up until now, because these were original stories rather than adaptations of prose works. During those 3 years, DC also published other TSR licensed products, like Forgotten Realms and Spelljammer, but Dragonlance came first, as it was easily the most popular at the time. This series was written almost entirely by Dan Mishkin, with art primarily by Ron Randall. To draw in fans of the Chronicles, the first issue has Sturm Brightblade, one of the companions, on the cover, and he's the first heroic figure we see in the book. However, he's quickly left behind, and the first story arc stars Sturm's uncle, Vander Brightblade, a former knight turned pacifist monk, and Riva Silvercrown, the daughter of a knight, doing what good she can in the world while striving to be recognized as a knight herself. This first story arc starts just a little bit before the opening events of the first novel, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and we get appearances from Kitiara, Lord Soth, and even Fizban, the human guise of the leader of the good gods, Paladine. This first arc also marks the only appearance in the series of the actual Dragonlance, the blessed weapon for which the setting gets its name, despite it actually being fairly unimportant in the story as a whole. I'm not going to give you all the details of each arc, but I will be going through them to let you know which recognizable characters show up and what time period the stories take place in. Since everyone has their own personal favorites, this may help you decide which issues to seek out, if this sounds like something that would interest you. Continuing on, the second storyline is titled Racelin's Pawn. Personally, Racelin, the sickly and cynical mage who eventually turned evil, was my favorite character. I even dressed up as him for Halloween one year. A picture will be in the show notes at the website. So this was the storyline that grabbed my attention. Unfortunately, Raistlin himself shows up only briefly, at the beginning and at the end of the arc, although his influence is felt throughout. This story takes place around the end of Book 3 of the Chronicles, Dragons of Spring Dawning, and also includes appearances from Flint, Taz, Lorana, and Caramon, although the lead characters are an apprentice mage named Myrella, a tinker gnome who goes by Natch, and the elf Calthanan of Quellanost. This story has the strongest tie to the narrative in the Chronicles series, even including the confrontation between Caramon and Raistlin underneath Naraka, leading into Baram's reunion with his sister that closes the gates to the Abyss. In the third story arc, named Arena of Istar, Riva Silvercrown returns, although Tanis from the Companions actually gets to take a starring role in this tale, which takes place in the fragile peace just after the War of the Lance. Tanis and Riva lead a diplomatic mission to negotiate a trade alliance between the Minotaurs of Krynn's Eastern Islands and the Knights of Solamnia, while Kitiara is there to work out a military alliance between the same Minotaurs and what remains of the Dragon Army post-war. This is the only story that I think somewhat contradicts the main novels, as we see Tanis and Kitiara interact after Tanis' marriage to Lorana, but before Tanis witnesses Kit's death in the Legends books, where it's either heavily implied or possibly even outright stated that the former lovers had not seen each other since the war. But I could be wrong about that. The next arc is titled High Sorcery, and as you would expect, deals with the wizards of the world, with the apprentice Myrella and her friend Natch returning from the Raistlin's Pawn arc. Myrella takes her test of high sorcery in this 4-part story, and as seems to be the case with every test we have seen documented, it's more than just the illusion the heads of the Order claim, and has long-term effects on the world of Krynn. Raistlin does not appear in this story, but is referenced multiple times, and at one point in her test, Myrella is teleported to the plains of Kyushu, and runs into Gold Moon and Riverwind, 2 former heroes of the Lance. This story takes place after the Legends books, as the pair reference Raistlin's failed attempt to become a god. Riva returns once again, and is the main character of the book from here forward, although the story arcs will move around in time, showing various portions of Riva's life. This 5th multi-issue arc takes place many years after the war, as Riva is now an old woman. This is the first story where none of the original heroes of the Lance make an appearance. However, Palin, Caramon's white-robed son, who is one of the main characters of the post-Legends books written by Weiss and Hickman, shows up in the final issue of the arc, so writer Dan Mishkin continues to tie the larger mythology of the setting into the lives of the characters he created for this series. The largest break from Weiss and Hickman's works comes in the next story arc, and continues for almost the rest of the book's run. As I mentioned, the book now belongs solely to Riva Silvercrown, arguably the main character for the series as a whole, although she's missing entirely from 2 story arcs. In this 6th arc, Riva is recruited by Fizban, at this point known to be the avatar of Paladine, to travel to the continent on the opposite side of Krynn, known as Taladas. The main story of Dragonlance takes place on the continent of Ansalon, and for the first few years of the setting's life, was the only known landmass. This story, as well as the next 2 arcs, deal with Riva's adventures on that far-off continent, and so no other characters from the original series show up. We also don't get any guest appearances from the Heroes of Lance or any other well-known Dragonlance characters in this penultimate arc of the book. Instead, we get stories of Riva's early life, as she's still living under her father's roof, trying desperately to prove her worthiness to be a knight, despite the current rules against women serving in the Salamnic Order. The final arc of the series takes us back to Taladas, where Riva is still fighting tyranny. Although we know from the 5th arc that Riva will get back to Ansalon eventually, the series ends with her still on the other side of the world, and doesn't give us much of a satisfying ending. I have to assume that Dan Mishkin had other stories he wanted to tell, but that low sales and/or license contracts not being renewed led to the cancellation of the series without a chance for him to wrap things up. As a whole, the Dragonlance setting has not seen much love from the current rights holder, Wizards of the Coast, although we have started to see signs of that possibly changing in the foreseeable future. Krynn was never referenced in the 4th edition books, and while we haven't gotten an official 5th edition source book for the World of Dragonlance yet, it's at least mentioned as one of the possible worlds in the player's handbook and other recent works. And with a new Weiss and Hickman novel on the way, this just might be Dragonlance's year to shine once again. But for now, we'll wait and see. I hope this look back at the Dragonlance comic helped whet your appetite for that, and also answered Jesse's question. And if this inspired other comics or role-playing questions, or you have something completely unrelated that you want me to talk about in a future episode, please let me know. Feel free to email me any comments or questions to welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you prefer to ask more anonymously. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome-to-geektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcome-to-geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.